I'm going to take the fun opportunity of introducing Tom Rosburg. Tom Rosburg is another really great thing that's happening in Greene County. And again, this year, he's been doing studies on Tipton Prairie, which is right above the Raccoon, about 3 miles downstream from me. And Tipton Prairie is, I hate to say original prairie, but it is a prairie remnant and has never been plowed that we know of. Doesn't have any marks of having ever been plowed, right? And has the original pioneer cemetery for our township is just beyond the prairie remnant. Anyway, he did floristic studies, he's done soil surveys, and this year, and I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about it, he is headlining and organizing the North American Prairie Conference. And Tipton Prairie is one of 4 prairies that are on the list of tours. Tom, come tell us about not just Tipton, but Prairie in general.
There's my talk right there. Remnants and Reconstructions in Prairie Conservation. I used to use this. Okay, great.
And you want to use that?
Do I need to use that microphone? I have a pretty loud voice. Yes.
Well, if not, but I'll show you how to turn it off.
All right, thank you for the invitation to come and speak to this group again. And we've done a lot of great things that you just heard Chris and Mike talk about. So I was invited to talk about prairies, one of my expertise areas. And so I want to kind of frame this in terms of, remnants and reconstructions. Both of these are very important in conserving prairie and the species that use prairie. Before I do that, though, I just want to reiterate something that Chris said. On the back of this little pamphlet here, there is information about the North American Prairie Conference. And if you really want to get into prairie and really have a great time learning about prairie and hearing a lot of people from all over the country, experts in all kinds of areas, 8 different symposia, lots of different field trips. And Tipton Prairie is one of the sites for one of the field trips. You should be thinking about attending this. This is last week in June 26th to the 29th. And so if you live in Des Moines or in the area, you don't have to pay for lodging. All you have to do is just the registration fee, which I think is a bargain price for 4 days of all kinds of opportunities and food, $325. If you have any questions about it, talk to me. Okay, so we're going to talk about remnants and reconstructions here with a special emphasis on the watershed. And to kind of get us going here, by the way, this picture is an award-winning photograph. This was the first time I actually won an award for my photography back in 1986. This was when the Iowa DNR, well, it was Iowa Conservation Commission then, published a book called The Iowa Conservationist. They had a photo contest. And in 1986, this was the first place winner. That's my daughter, who is now 40 years old. All right, so I'm going to start this by, dropping the clicker. Yeah. And push this one. Yeah, there we go. All right, got it figured out. A couple of years ago, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, I was invited to write an essay for this effort, Compelling Ground, Landscapes, Environments, and Peoples of Iowa. It was kind of a follow-up to 25 years earlier, a group of essays had been published about the Les Hills. This one was kind of broadened out to look at the entire state. So I did, and I'm going to just read a portion of that because it helps us get into the mood, I suppose, here, you might say, in terms of what I'm going to be covering. Need my glasses. So this is Iowa as we see it now today, of course, unfortunately. I don't have everything represented there, but there's one of those confinements Chris is talking about. There's all that erosion and a lot of bad stuff happening there. There's all those monocrops, one plant species for the most part out there in all of those fields. All right, I confess, I may have a risky habit. Whenever I am driving to some field site in Iowa for research or to lead a field trip at a state preserve, or better yet, to make nature pictures with a camera, I gaze out upon the landscape passing by and daydream. I try to envision the landscape as it was 200 years ago. In my mind, I see a verdant blanket of prairie vegetation instead of cornfields. A herd of elk in a savanna instead of stock cows in wooded pasture. Or the orange-yellow flames and grayish-white smoke of a prairie fire instead of a red and white farmstead. Whoops. Well, I'm sorry. There we go. It can't work on as I planned it. All right. All right. I have to make sure I push the right button here. Where was okay? And it's not just a generalized picture. It gets specific as I analyze the landscape, the geology, and the landform, my location, and think about the types of native communities and the plants that would be present. I imagine a landscape that once was because I yearned to hike into that landscape and see what is there. What did thousands of years of prairie, savanna, and woodland expansion and development post-Wisconsin glaciation produce? What did 40 million years of evolution in the central North American grassland biome craft? How did these fully intact and natural ecosystems function? How have the thousands of species from fungi, protozoans, and invertebrates hidden in the soil, the butterflies, birds, and bats sharing the sky, carve out a niche and claim their place? What amazing complex discoveries of nature might be found? These are the questions that wander through my mind as I drive down the road. So we went from what Iowa is, and we see it all the time when we drive anywhere in Iowa, of course, to, again, what I'm imagining, but what you can still see if you look in the right place, the remnants. Places that are just so fantastic. I would challenge any of you to really think about how you can even begin to fathom what it really looked like in 1800 to walk out into a state of 30 million acres of prairie and savanna. Never-ending vistas. So, what is a remnant? It seems to be pretty easy to think and define, I suppose, what a remnant is, but here's some definitions from the Fermi Lab. Significant native vegetation because it was never drained, if you're talking about a wetland, or never plowed, if you're talking about a prairie, or clear cut, if it's a woodland or forest. I would say that's probably not quite true, though, for clear cutting a forest, because that forest can still grow back. We'll see how that definition gets revised a little bit. Here's one from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They refer to it as an original native ecological community, left relatively undisturbed. Again, since Wisconsin, they're putting a time frame on it there, some 15,000 years ago. And they say that remnants again offer this great opportunity to see what a place, Wisconsin in this case, looked like before European settlement. Okay, well, that's more or less true. And of course, we have to look at Wikipedia, right? Everyone's choice for getting data and information. An ecological community containing native flora and fauna that has not been significantly disturbed by destructive activities, such as the list: agriculture, logging, pollution, development, fire suppression, threw that in there, or non-native species invasion. So these are all kind of pointing at the same thing, of course. I would offer my own definition that really cuts to the chase, really gets down to what's really important. And that's an ecosystem supporting a community, first of all, comprised of populations of native species. Seems pretty simple, but yes, it has to be native species, first of all. And add to that, these populations are derived from ancestors that formerly occupied that site. So there's a lineage of genes there. These didn't come from someplace else. These species, again, are a result of generations of presence, or we could also argue that even in some cases, remnants could be described in places where there's been some natural dispersal. I think to some extent, we have to have some kind of threshold of quality to define when we actually have a remnant versus something else. And that's going to depend upon kind of what your definition, I guess, of what quality is, but basically some kind of threshold of numbers of species. In a sense, really, a remnant is just simply, to put it as simply as you can, an ecologically intact, but always degraded. They're always going to be degraded here. You know, obviously, these are places that have been used by people for years and years and years, but it still has some ecological complexity and something to it again that ties us to this history of this land, the site that we're standing on, this remnant being occupied by these species for a long period of time. Why do we have remnants? Well, there's a number of reasons. Biggest reason for is prairie, and we're going to focus on prairie now, of course. The reason we have prairie remnants is because they were used by individuals as prairie hay. Okay, you know, it's really not rocket science. I mean, the reason we have prairie remnants is because somebody didn't take the time and bother to plow it up. Because if it had been plowed up until it's gone. So why didn't they do that? Well, because they could find another use for it. Our best remnants are those that were used for prairie hay. This is Woodside Prairie in Adair County. It's still privately owned. It's still being used for prairie hay. This is one of the best prairies in the state. Because it turns out, actually using a prairie for prairie hay is the best thing someone could do to preserve it. Because that haying once a year at the end of the growing season, usually in August or probably mid-August to early September or so, when the productivity was the highest, most closely mimics the natural fire regime that would have been occurring. Again, natural lightning caused fires occurring in the late growing season. And haying isn't the same ecologically as fire, not 100%, but it's probably the most similar thing one can do. If you can't burn a prairie because of where you are or just because of the situation, the next best thing you can do is hay, because that will accomplish many of the same things. It removes all of the litter. Another reason, of course, was it was used for pasture rather than a hay field. Of course, some of these could have been used for both of these things, of course. And so early settlers utilized portions of the land that they homesteaded as pasture, prairie pasture. Unfortunately, a lot of times they did pasture improvement practices, which then was heading down the road of destroying that prairie. But in many, many cases, that wasn't really done very well, or not really done very much, or because it cost too much. And so minimal pasture improvement was done. And those are where the best prairies then still reside. Difficult or no access to get in there and fill it up. And there are several things that can contribute to this. Obviously, too steep. That's why we have so much prairie in the Lost Hills. Although I've seen some of that is still not protected from farming, because there are farmers who are crazy enough to till up, not land that steep, but land that they shouldn't be on. Near surface bedrock. That's what saved all the Flint Hills in Kansas. Shallow soil, very shallow soil. Not enough to plow, because 2 inches down, you're getting rock. This is Haynes Prairie up in Floyd County. Limestone bedrock underlies that prairie. There's no way to plow that. Bedrock is too close to the surface. How about too wet, too dry? A Lots of examples there. Williams Prairie down in Johnson County. Now, that was remedied, of course, by tiling at some point. And so that didn't always work, because when tiling came along in the 30s, that started to remove those prairies. Or maybe really dry ones, again, like some of our sand prairies. Really not very feasible to farm those, because there's just not much soil. There's too much sand there, very dry. That didn't stop, unfortunately, lots of conservation organizations from planting pines on them, though. And it turns out that planting pines on sand prairies was, again, probably one of the biggest reasons for the loss of sand prairies. Some of them are just isolated by ownership, and that just simply means that due to where they're located, and maybe a creek cutting off a corner of some property, and the fact that the person who owns that property can't get to that prairie because they can't get across the creek. Cows can, but the machinery can't get across the creek, and they can't come in from the other side because they don't own the land over there. Someone else owns the land on the other side. So that happens too. That helped to protect some. Then we have right-of-ways, like the Rippy Prairie and cemeteries. They're a lot smaller. This is King Cemetery in Crawford County. So these are the main reasons why remnants persisted. And this is what we then have the benefit of seeing and learning. All the glory and majesty and just amazement and wonder, complexity. Those are just the beginning of some adjectives up there in my mind in terms of how I think about Prairie. So how much do we have in Iowa? That's a good question. The map here, first up here in the upper left, that's the central grassland biome, which includes tall grass. I call that midgrass rather than mixed grass, and short grass prairies, of course. The central grassland biome was created by the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. So when the Rocky Mountains formed for the last time, the most recent time, ending about 40 million years ago, that's when the climate became suitable, drier climate. The rain shadow came into strong effect, and we have the drier climate that, again, is going to foster the grasslands in this area. The map on the below just shows the tall grass prairie, and it shows the stippling here. It's meant to show how, as you get to the east, it starts blending in, of course, with the deciduous forest. You get more savannas and woodlands. Oops, I want to refer to this map here. There we go. So, and then this map over here on the right, this one, of course, is the Government Land Office map that comes from the land surveyors who surveyed Iowa and other states and made comments about what the vegetation was that they were seeing. And so you interpret this map simply by looking at, you know, the map, which this was a big project done by a group at Iowa State, but they decided that the land surveyors were seeing prairie, and they covered that with yellow then, and the lighter green is savanna, the darker green forest or woodland, and the wetlands bluish color there. We can at least kind of divide out Iowa with those four basic ecosystems. Again, according to what land surveyors were saying they were seeing. But remember, land surveyors are not plant ecologists, they're land surveyors. And so they had a whole bunch of different terms. You can't read these, I know, but there's just a whole bunch of different terms they used to describe what the landscape looked like. And that's what this team from Iowa State had to do then, had to reconcile basically that variation. And this is what they came up with. If you look at this, then we see that prairie, 28.5 million acres. This is the percentages, of course, savanna 2.2 million, and on down the list there. We combine savanna and prairie because in many ways they are very, very similar, of course. Savanna is prairie with a few large scattered trees. We have about 85 or 86% of Iowa covered by prairie and savanna, according to the land surveyors. Another way of looking at this, and probably maybe a little bit better way of looking at this, because this gives us more detail, and the land surveyors, again, you know, we're not quite sure what they meant when they used some of those terms, is to look at the soils, because there's a real fundamental difference between soils formed under prairie vegetation. These are mollisols, versus soils formed under forest, woodland, and savanna. Unfortunately, it comes in there too, called alpha soils. And this is a map that shows the distribution of mollisols in Iowa. So by making that connection, that means we can interpret that to mean that this is where prairies were, because prairies made mollisols. Mollisols are characterized by a mollicipedon, which means that's that really dark black layer of topsoil that form under prairies because of the growth and death of root systems for thousands of years, adding that organic matter. They also have a higher base saturation, which means they have more nutrients, a lot more nutrients, more fertile. Alpha soil is going to have this clay accumulation, it's going to have a lower base saturation, and it's usually going to have this E horizon, which is that white layer underneath the A horizon. So it's pretty easy for soil scientists to make a distinction between an alpha soil and a mollisol, and then they use that to say, what was the native vegetation that formed this soil? If you look at that, prairie and savanna combine to about 31.7, just a little bit more. It's pretty close to what the land surveyors had. This compares more directly based on soil and based on the land surveyors, what the percentages are of those four types. So again, we can be pretty confident with either of these two data sets that if you look at prairie and savanna together, we're certainly around 85 to 88% of the state. But remember, it's not all the same kind of prairie. I like to put this slide in just because this shows, of course, the landforms in Iowa. Iowa is not as boring as a lot of people want to make us think. I know it may seem that way as you drive across, well, Interstate 35, I suppose, at least from Minnesota down to Ames. It starts getting interesting, of course, once you get south of Des Moines, and I-80, of course, goes mainly across the southern Iowa drift plain, so that's kind of nice and rolling. But it's not, again, all table flat, as we know. And we've got each of these landforms comprised of a very, very different geological history. Each of these landforms then also has different kinds of soils. And then each of these soils has different kinds of prairie. So yes, we're mainly tall grass prairie in Iowa, of course. We're in a tall grass prairie climate, but we have lots of different kinds of prairie, tall grass prairie. And that's what this slide is trying to show. The words here, of course, just kind of refer to the kinds of environmental conditions. For example, in the Des Moines Lobe, we have gravelly moraine areas, we have this deep black soil, we've got places with poor drainage. That creates the kinds of prairies you see at the Lower Prairie, for example. And you just go around the state there and you can see again the diversity in these prairies. How much do we have left? This is an article published in Bioscience back in 1994 that shows Iowa having, and I don't know for sure where they got their data, where Sampson and Knopf got their data. That wasn't made clear, but I think they got someone from the Nature Conservancy. They use hectares here, but I converted it to acres for you. Basically, they show 30.9 million acres, and that's not too far off what I was just showing you. Very close to the same. And that reduced to 30,000 acres. That's what we have left, and that's less than 0.1%. Often you hear in Iowa people say we have less than 0.1% of prairie left, less than 0.1%, and that's just under 0.1%. Why, of course? Why was prairie lost? Well, obviously this was the biggest reason: conversion to ag, tillage, plowing. Turns out the early European settlers were, once the John Deere plow came along, became very good at plowing up the prairie. So that, of course, is the number one reason. Then we have woody encroachment, of course, in places where plowing couldn't happen, like the Loess Hills. Much of the loss of prairie in the Loess Hills is, again, not due to plowing. It's too steep to plow. It's due to the lack of fire suppression, and encroachment by woody vegetation. Unfortunately, a lot of people that aren't familiar with Iowa, visitors maybe, and even Iowans driving through the Loess Hills or across Iowa, they drive I-80, for example, and come through there at Council Bluffs, and they see the Loess Hills for the first time. You see this rugged landscape, this tree covered. And you finally think, oh, wow, this is really cool. This was all nice tree covered forest land. No, it wasn't. That's not what it was. It was prairie and savanna land that, due to the lack of fire, has become forest land. We also, of course, have those pastures, those improved pastures I was talking about. Pastures could be good because it prevented it from being tilled, but if it was a really modern farmer, really up on speed, and he was using all the greatest, advancements in producing forage, like fertilizer and herbicides, planting cool season grasses to increase the yield of grasses early in the growing season, that's called pasture improvement. And that was done to make it more of a monotypic, or maybe 3 or 4 species pasture of 3 or 4 European forage grasses. Smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, timothy, fescue, top 5 species right there. And in the process of doing that, the prairie was driven out. They use herbicides, of course, to kill the weeds. Well, what are the weeds? The prairie forests. Those were the weeds. Then we have a little bit of loss of savanna, mostly to suburban development. That still happens. And we have a little bit of loss, of course, in those cemeteries because of cemetery expansion. But those are much more minor amounts. So what does this look like then? You look at this map that came from Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. This is a map that utilizes the Government Land Office surveys, those surveyor notes, and shows the prairie here in orange. And then they've combined savanna and forest and woodlands all into a single green color. And then the wetlands and rivers are blue. So that's what Iowa was, again, before we became a state in 1846. And I'm going to wash over that now with what it is now in 2009. And now corn and soybeans, of course, are the gray areas. We still have, well, the same orange color, but now it's including prairie maybe. That was map 1, but this map 2 now is a lot of cool season pasture. But you see, again, that less than 0.1% that I gave you a while back, the amount of prairie left in Iowa, less than 0.1%. That's for the entire state of Iowa as a whole. That's not the way it is everywhere in Iowa. Because we can see right here, based on this orange color right here, that there's more prairie out here, of course, in Los Hills. And from my research, the amount of prairie left in Los Hills, you just take a random 160-acre piece of land, could be up to 25%. 25 to 30% of the prairie could still be left in the Los Hills. That's what hasn't been encroached upon by trees yet, or hasn't been plowed up. The big place, of course, for prairie is southern Iowa. Lots of prairie down there. It's what I call the invisible prairie because it's out there on those pastures and you don't really see it or know that it's there unless you go out there and really look for it and know what you're looking for. And then, of course, the other places up in northeast Iowa and those hill prairies. This is all of the known state preserves of prairie. The red circles there are the known, really high quality state preserves that contain prairie. And you see that they're all kind of scattered throughout the rest of the state there. There's some in the Los Hills, there's one in the Southern Iowa Driftland. This is Rolling Thunder prairie down here. But the acreage on those prairies is far, far less than the acreage in all the others. Because these state preserves, we're talking about a 20-acre prairie, a 40-acre prairie, maybe a 160-acre prairie. So again, and down in southern Iowa, my research has shown that up to 10% of the prairie can be left down there. Up to 10%. So, and I have to apologize to Beth. As soon as I walked in and I saw her, I thought, oh my gosh, I forgot to add the net twig henning prairie remnant. I was doing some of this at 2 o'clock this morning, so that's maybe the reason. But so let's look at remnants in the Raccoon River watershed. how do they stack up? There, of course, is the watershed outlined on the landforms. You can see it primarily occurs on the Des Moines lobe. That does not bear well for remnants then on the Des Moines lobe, of course. The Des Moines lobe is highly agriculturalized. We overlap a little bit into the southern Iowa drift plain there, the southern portion of the watershed there, the south and middle Raccoon River watersheds. There's the whole thing over there. These maps, by the way, I have to give credit to, I got them from the master plan for the Raccoon River watershed, which was, I think, supported by M&M, RC&D, and done by Agron out of Carroll. So what you see on this map over here, those red or purplish dots are remnants that I know of, at least, what I know of and what I could find. And here's a list of them. Castle Prairie State Preserve is this one up here. It's just on the very edge. It's in the southern part of Pocahontas County there. Munson Prairie is right next to it there in northern Calhoun County. Liskastanic is this one over here. It's just a little ways off, essentially, but I decided to include it because it's really close there. Schureman Prairie is in Greene County right here. I'll show you some pictures of these. Then we get to Rippey and Tipton Prairies down here in southern Greene County. Then we hit the jackpot when we get into Guthrie County, because we're getting into the southern Iowa drift plain, where agriculture doesn't have quite the effect. Toole Prairie and White Rock Conservancy, and then the Netwig, Henning Prairie and Savannah should be like right here, right next to White Rock. There should be a dot there for that one. Then we have Sheep Prairie, Kent Sheep right here. I'm actually doing an inventory on that. I'll be out there this afternoon, probably working on that. Prairie is a small 3-acre site. Then Judson Prairie, right here, John Judson's Prairie right here. And I know there's some prairie at Springbrook State Park right there. This is Bunt Prairie right here. This is Sheeter Prairie right here. And then I know of a couple sites down here. This is Keene Conservation Area in Dallas County. There are some prairie remnants there. I've seen them. And then Losey Prairie, a prairie that I've been working on, Drake Prairie Rescue's been working on since about 2005, down there in the southwest part of Dallas County. That's what I know of. There's probably some other prairies in Guthrie County that I don't know of. I know of one other one that John Judson's shown me. I couldn't remember where it was for sure. And I asked him for a map, but he never got it to me. So here's a quick picture. That's Shoreman Prairie. It's pretty degraded. That's mostly cool season grass that you're looking at there, unfortunately. There's Toole Prairie. John Judson owns this one. This is just to the east of White Rock. That's Castle Prairie. That's a state preserve. That's Tipton Prairie. I'll say more about Tipton Prairie in just a little bit. That's Judson Prairie, another prairie that John Judson owns. That is a prairie remnant at White Rock Conservancy, a sandstone prairie. Sandstone prairies are pretty unique and really only occur in the Raccoon River Watershed Association, where there is Dakota sandstone exposed, geologically speaking. Another important ramification of geology and what those landforms are. That one, I have this labeled as Lewis Prairie on my slide. I couldn't find a Lewis Prairie in Guthrie County. I think that's an old name for a Bunt Prairie. Does anybody know from Guthrie County? Lewis Prairie, Bunt Prairie, are they the same? I think so, but I'll have to dig into that more. And there's a sandstone prairie at Springbrook State Park. All right, so of all of these prairie remnants in the watershed, I haven't seen every single one of them, of course, but I've seen a lot of them. I've done a lot of work on Tipton, as Chris was saying, and Tipton is, I think, by far the best of all of them. No doubt about that. Just a quick look at some of the flora at Tipton. The first picture there is Western wiregrass, Muhlenbergia cuspidata. Tipton is uniquely important because it is a dry, gravelly, outwash, sandy, somewhat sandy, gravelly soil, at least up on top. And that's promoting a very dry prairie microclimate and environment. And so we get some of these Western species like Western wiregrass, which is a Great Plains species growing there. That's one of the beauties out there. And there's not a lot of plants out there, but, and that's another point of concern, really. The county should be doing some work to protect those wood lilies because unfortunately deer like to eat them. And it just takes 2 or 3 deer to wipe out a population of wood lilies that's gone downhill and has maybe only got 10 plants left. The other one, there's white prairie clover, of course. There's prairie gentians. There's one you'll see a lot of out there, pale purple coneflower. Prairie dodder, a parasitic plant. This is another western species, western evening prairie primrose. Again, one of those species that shows this affinity to the Great Plains. There's a sky blue aster. Oh, that's silky aster, excuse me. Silky. There's a lot of sky blue aster there too. A lot of butterfly milkweed out there. A lot of prairie dropseed. Fair amount of ground plum. And one of the most prominent sedges out there, Bicknell's sedge, which is a good prairie species. So if you haven't seen Tipton, I don't know field trips lined up yet, I guess, but I'm sure there'll be something sometime. It is worth a visit. Oops. All right, what is a reconstruction? I got 10 minutes. Okay, so what is a reconstruction on the other hand? We've been looking at remnants. I hope you're impressed by remnants. So reconstructions are in this realm of restoration. It's a process of having an ecosystem recover, bringing an ecosystem back. Recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. I want to make a distinction here. If it's completely destroyed, then the only opportunity for restoration is, oops, my finger's too big. The only opportunity for restoration is what we call reconstruction. Reconstruction and renovation are 2 forms of restoration. Restoration is the big umbrella term that just describes, again, bringing an ecosystem back. How do you bring it back? Depends on what you have to begin with. So renovation is what happens when you are repairing a remnant that's degraded, but still there. Reconstruction is what happens when you are starting from scratch to construct again, because there's nothing left. So a renovation would happen on a remnant like this. This is a prairie remnant down in Southern Iowa in Ringgold County. Reconstructions always happen in agricultural crop fields or often cool season pastures, because again, in those environments, there are no prairie species left. They're gone. It's a totally different thing. You understand whether you have anything left that you have to be concerned about, or if you don't. It's a whole lot more mindful operation and careful operation when you've got a remnant that you're trying to renovate and help nurse back to a better example of what it once was. This says again that has been damaged. No, it has to be destroyed, really. These are damaged. These are damaged. All remnants are damaged. Every single remnant is damaged because every single remnant had Euro Americans making a living off of it for a long period of time, of course. And whether it's one of the best ones like Woodside Prairie, which has been hayed, as I said, for over 100 years, and is probably one of the best remnants, it still has had that annual haying. It hasn't had bison on it, hasn't had elk on it, hasn't had fire on it. So it's not the same. It's not the same as what it was when the Woodsides homesteaded that land. Now, what they did was compatible with the prairie, and it survived in pretty good form, but it's not the same prairie. It's degraded too. In many cases, we don't really know what prairie should look like because we don't have any good examples of actually intact ecosystems that have been operating as they did for thousands and thousands of years, again, before we came along. Well, reconstruction, again, is important, certainly.
excuse me, a few comments about it. The first reconstruction, and most agree, is that Curtis Prairie there up in Wisconsin. Here's a reconstruction process. If you've never done one, it is a process of agriculture, really, because it's planting. You're going to be planting prairie if you're going to reconstruct a prairie. You have to prepare the site, you have to design a seed mix, put the seed out there somehow. Then there's some management, of course, to follow up. I would say, if you just want to say something really quick about reconstructions versus remnants, it's pretty easy to say, I think, based on, I've seen lots of these, of course. Reconstructions are always going to have lower diversity than a remnant. They're always going to be more homogeneous. I'll talk about that. And there's always introduced species that are likely to be present too. Species not native to North America, or even species that are native to North America, but not to that place where the reconstruction is. Thank you. So now I'll have to get through this pretty quickly here, but here's what I think are the most critical components. If you're interested in reconstruction, you need some help, talk to me. I help anyone who asks for help how to get this done right, because in my opinion, there's a lot of reconstructions being done that are not right at all. But I'm finicky. So obviously the plant should be native to the site. That doesn't always happen. They should be native to your place, your county. They should be appropriate ecologically for the soil, the light conditions, the kind of soil. You got to pay attention to what kind of soil it is, what the soil series is. Get that off the soil map. I try to reconstruct prairies to mimic real prairies. That's the point, right? And that means designing a seed mix. And this is all going into the seed mix again. Seed mix design is the most critical component of that whole 4-step process there. It's the thing that most people need to help with. Get the seed mix designed right so it looks like a prairie. Because not all prairie species are the same abundance in a remnant. That doesn't work that way. They all have differences in their life history strategies. And again, just simply the way they've responded to the environment, that makes them all different. Local ecotype, you've probably heard that. But here's the important information you need to know. Local ecotype does not mean in the same county. A lot of people, at least used to be somewhat true, and it still is to some extent, really push local ecotype as being, oh, you can't plant anything unless the seed comes from the same county. That's ridiculous. There's no evidence at all that local ecotypes occur on that scale. From the work I've done in reading research, I haven't researched this myself, but I've done a lot of reading. I would say, and what I follow for my own plantings, if I can get seed within 150 miles from where I'm planting it, that's local. Within 150 miles. And you actually want to do that. Because this is the thing that's really important, genetic variation being incorporated into the seed mix design. The notion that you can only get seed or should only get seed from 20 miles or so is counterintuitive to this. That contributes to the lack of genetic variation, which is a more serious threat to plants than ecotype. So, remnant versus reconstruction. Here's the quick lowdown. Remnants, well, obviously there's a finite amount. They're not being made anymore. They're still being destroyed, unfortunately. You'd think we could stop that, but they're still being destroyed. No limit on reconstructions, of course. We can make as many reconstructions as we can, as we have money for. It's somewhat constrained by politics, unfortunately. But it could be a potential large part of what the prairie landscape looks like. That's the only way we can regain a landscape that looks like the original prairie, at least, with reconstruction. Remnants are, and I can't emphasize this enough, ecologically invaluable. You cannot put a price tag on them. The only ecosystems that, for many species, the only place you're going to find them. There are many plant species you'll only find on remnants. They're going to be more complex with more species interactions. More of what the natural ecosystem processes are expected to be present there. It kind of depends on the size, of course. In a reconstruction, they're important. Certainly they are. They provide habitat and structure and food for grassland species that don't really care what the name of that species is, as long as it's something that makes the habitat look like a grassland. They're going to be much less complex, and many of them do provide some ecosystem processes like maybe carbon sequestration or certainly the reduction of soil erosion, those sorts of things. So they're very important. But remnants have the first priority, no doubt, in terms of protection. I wish we could find every single one of them and protect them, because they are built by nature. That's the thing, remember? They are the model for how to do reconstructions. Reconstructions have this second priority. They will always be a human invention. Can't escape that. You walk out on a reconstruction, what you're going to see is what someone decided to plant. That's not the way a remnant works. There's always going to be mistakes on reconstructions. Always. Humans make mistakes in everything we do, and I've seen plenty of them. The nice thing is that given enough time, like 10, 20, 30 years, reconstructions start getting more as a product of nature and less of a product of the humans that started it. And that's good. Ask yourself, if you had an hour to spare, where would you go? You have two choices, go to a reconstruction or go to a remnant. There's no problem deciding where to go.
Except for
No.
Mike Delaney's Prairie.
Well, I don't know about that. I've never been there. Maybe I need to go there, huh?
But you have,
This is the only place, I don't care how good your prairie is, Mike, I'm not going to get a spiritual connection with the land, history, and evolution of that site. Because I know it's planted by you. All right. I don't have much time, so I'm going to skip over this. This is more about the downside of reconstruction, more on the problem of homogenization, making everything look the same. Again, don't have time to go through all of that, but that's one of the big problems of reconstructions is, unfortunately, they are too simple. And that's because of the availability of seed to some extent and the cost. And because the all-time seed mixes are not being done right, again, that's that picture I showed you of how prairies were used to be in Iowa, very different from one another as you move around the state. What happens with this homogenization process is people, when they design seed mixes, they said, as long as it's an Iowa species, I can plant it. No, you can't just plant it because it's an Iowa species, because lots of prairie species, shooting star, rosinweed, and downy mountain mint, just 3 examples of probably 300 species, have distributions that look like that. They do not live in every part of the state naturally. They're only found in a subset of the state, in certain counties. And so if you live in Fremont County and you're planting a shooting star, you're making a huge mistake. Yes, it's native to Iowa, but it doesn't mean it's native to your county. All right, the reason that reconstructions can be very helpful, I'll read through this real quick, is what I talk about in this book. If you haven't seen this book yet, Tending Iowa's Land, I imagine most never heard about it, so I won't say too much more. I wrote the chapter 16 here. Jim Peace is sitting in the audience, and he's right there before me. So this is again about how to correct all of our environmental problems that Connie Mutel envisioned and saw through to the end. She was the driving force, and she gave me the task of talking about biodiversity and how do we fix our biodiversity problem. Because again, we've lost a lot of it. You can't lose 99.9% of your prairie and not have a problem with biodiversity, or 92% of your wetlands, or 75% of your forests and woodlands. So what it comes down to, saving Iowa's biodiversity, is simply a public and private cooperation approach. The main point here is that working landscapes means we have to have landscapes that are good for people and good for biodiversity. In other words, both people can make a living. We can't neglect the fact that people have to make a living in Iowa. We have to farm. But we can farm in a way, much better way, and that's what working landscapes means, balances social, economic, ecological needs, mutual sustainability. The idea of a working landscape is that the people living there and the biodiversity they're sharing the land with are both supported. Both have to be supported. That's how we maintain landscape in the future. 30 by 30 plan, excuse me, which again is what I advocate here. It says we need to have at least 30% of our land in some kind of conservation value. That means conservation land means it supports biodiversity at least at some level. Biodiversity is being supported by conservation land. We need to have conservation land. Again, 30% of Iowa needs to be in some kind of conservation land. Almost all of that will be private. We're not going to get 30% of Iowa in public land. That's never going to happen. So we build a working landscape around regenerative agriculture because that's what we do in Iowa, agriculture. We have the soils to do it. So that means we utilize these 5 pillars of sustainable ag, regenerative ag, and we have farms that are managed as ecosystems. And pay attention to ecological rules and processes and functions. And by doing that, we can get 30% of Iowa. Now, that means we need 10.8 million acres to get 30%. We have 36 million acres. We have about 4.7 million acres of conservation land. We need another 6.1 million acres of conservation land to get to 30%. That's all going to probably come from land that is being farmed in a bad way. Farmland that is classified as marginal, farmland that's being eroded at twice the rate that it should be, that's sustainable. We have to find a way to target this kind of farmland and make it sustainable for the farmer and for biodiversity. That's what this plan is about. First, protect every remnant. Use this working landscape model to transform agricultural land, marginal farmland into land that looks like that, where we can do these sorts of things. Habitat for biodiversity, decrease soil erosion, improve water quality. How is a farmer going to make a living? Beef production. That's the only option really for this land that's growing prairie or woodlands or savannas. Beef production. That's the model of the prairie. Bison and elk grazing on prairie. We would have enough rangeland if we did this on the 6.1 million acres. We'd have enough rangeland to support all of the beef cattle being raised in capos.
Really?
Something we want to get rid of. So that's it. Do I have time? Like 2 more minutes?
No,
No? Okay. This is the best part.
you're gonna stick around though, right?
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions for you. Yeah, I don't want him coming to my prairie because you'll say, that's wrong, you know, like that fox club. Probably doesn't belong in Dallas County, right?
You have Penstemon digitalis.
Yeah.
You're on the edge of it.
Oh,
You're
okay,
probably
I'm
right.
on the edge. I've been very hard,